Well, hello and welcome back to Stuff in Excel. I'm Richard. What we're going to do in this video is take a look at user-defined calculated items in a pivot table. Now, in pivot table terminology, an item is a row of data. A field is a column of data. So what we want to do is figure out how do we create these calculated items, calculated rows in a pivot table that we've already created. And I'm going to show you exactly how to do that. Let's begin with this data file. This data file can be accessed, by the way, as with all of our videos here on Stuff in Excel. If you go to the description section of the video in YouTube, you can see a link, and that link will take you to where you can download the Excel file so that you can follow along with this exercise. So we'll start with this data, and you'll notice what we have is revenues, cost of sales, distribution expenses, facilities expenses, and SG&A expenses for 12 months. Now remember, we're going to be trying to add an item to this, which is a row to this data. First thing we're going to do is put this data in a pivot table format. So we click anywhere in the pivot table, we'll say insert, and then we'll do pivot table over here on the far left, and it'll ask us where our data is. We've already defined that. Remember, Excel can tell if you're in a contiguous set of data where that data starts and ends. We're going to put it on a new worksheet, and I'll hit OK, and it's going to add a new worksheet down here at the bottom. I'm going to rename that. I'm going to call it pivot table. Now, I'm going to create a pivot table with accounts and with the first 3 months. That'll give us the first quarter of data. And I will make this bigger so that we can see it and work with it a little easier. So with this data, you'll notice, first of all, that the data is in a different order than it was originally. Revenue has now been moved down. This is in alphabetical order, which is something that Excel does. But I will click on this, and I can change this or move this revenue simply by moving my cursor to the top line of this cell, the top border of this cell, till I get the little arrow that has 4 directional arrows on it. I can now drag that up, and it'll bring all the data with it. And now I've got revenue, cost of sales, distribution expenses, facilities expenses, and SG&A expenses. Now you'll notice there's no gross margin in here. There's also no total expenses or no net income. It does have a grand total line, which is kind of useless to us. Just adding up the total of revenues and expenses means nothing. So let's get rid of this grand total. We click in that area. We're going to go to Design tab up here at the very top. Click on this Design tab up here. And when we click on the Design tab, then go all the way over to the left, we're going to click on Grand Totals, drop down and hit Click Off for rows and columns. And it's going to take that grand total line away, which is very helpful to us. Now, the next thing we're going to do is we want to add a gross margin line to this data. And the logical thing would be to insert gross margin between distribution and cost of sales. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to right-click. I can click on that row. I'm going to right-click and hit Insert, and it's going to tell me that it cannot do it. It's an error I get because I cannot add a row or an item to an existing pivot table. So how do I get around this? Well, I could just add a row at the bottom, and I'll say gross margin. And we'll say that's going to be my sales minus my cost of sales. I don't know what that did. Let's try that again. I'm going to say equals minus cost of, minus cost of sales. It's kind of weird the way it gives us that data. And we get that data there. And that's not, it's a formula up here at the top, and I can copy that around, but it's telling me it's taking this data from a pivot table. And look what it did. It didn't even take the formula all the way across. That's not going to be good for us. And in addition, if I click in the pivot table and go over to accounts, I can look at the drop-down menu, and we can see that in accounts, if I go to the drop-down menu for that, gross margin is not in that list. And it's not in that list because it didn't add it to the pivot table. So what are we going to do? Well, we're going to need to delete this row and try something different. So let's go back to the original data and try that. What if we tried to insert a line down at the bottom here, gross margin, and we'll say that is equal to revenue minus sales. And it'll do that, and I can copy that formula all the way across my 12 months. And now I can go back to my pivot table and I can see if it updated. I click anywhere in the table, go to Pivot Table Analyze, go to Refresh All, and it did not add it to the table. And in fact, it also did not add it over here under my list of items that are in that particular field. Okay, so that didn't work. So let's go back and get rid of that. So we'll go back and we'll just delete that data. Now, there's a third thing we could try. We could, or maybe it's a fourth thing now, I've lost count. We can insert gross margin between distribution and cost of sales. So we'll click on that row, right-click, insert, and we're going to type in gross margin. And we'll say that's equal to revenue minus cost of goods sold. And we can copy that all the way across. And it adds it in there. Now let's go back to our pivot table. And if we do let's do another refresh on this. Table Analyze, Refresh All. And I want you to notice it adds it. And it adds it down here at the bottom. And in fact, if in my accounts item, it lists a gross margin item in that field now. But it's not dynamic, and it is also a number, you can see that's a number up here, not a formula. And I can drag this, of course, but that's a really inefficient way to do it. And by the way, I cannot edit that if I later add something like sales returns or sales allowances or sales discounts. So what do I do with that? So that's not going to work. So let's get rid of that. And we'll go back to the original data and we'll get rid of that as well. And so let's go do an easier way, and that is to do a user-defined item in this pivot table. Now, the way we do that, we click anywhere in the pivot table and we go up to Pivot Table Analyze. Now, for some of you, this may be two separate tabs or it may be one tab. I've got a newer version of Excel, so it's all one tab. Some places it may be two tabs. If it is, click on Analyze. We'll just click on Pivot Table Analyze here. And we're going to click on this item that says Fields, Items, and Sets. Now, it's going to give me an option to add a user-defined field and a user-defined item. And I click on this, and there's my calculated field. It doesn't let me add a calculated item. Why is that? Well, it's because I did not click over here to the left. I clicked over here in the middle of the table. If I had clicked over here in the first column of the pivot table and then gone to Field, Items, and Sets, it would allow me to add a calculated item. So that's what we're going to do at this point. I'll hit Calculated Item, and it brings up this particular item here. Now, if you've got gross margin in here somewhere, that's going to be because you deleted things instead of doing the undo button. If you do the undo button, it takes it away. If you just deleted those, that gross margin item may still be in there. So we may want to still add a item between distribution and cost of sales called gross margin. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go up here. I've got this. I'm going to type in GM in case you've got gross margin in your items. We'll ignore it and we'll type in GM for gross margin. Now I'm going to hit Tab. Do not click the Add button. I want you to click the Tab button. If you click the Add button, it messes everything up. All your items go away. What you really want is you want to hit the Tab button here. Hit the Tab button. It takes you down to the formula line. And it highlights equals 0. So what we're going to do now is we're going to double click on revenue, and it'll add revenue. I'll hit the minus, and I'll double click on cost of sales. Now I want you to notice something here. When we did this, revenue is just a word all by itself up here with no apostrophe before or after it. That's because Excel recognizes that as a continuous string of characters. Now, cost of sales has a apostrophe before it and after it, and that is because it has spaces in there. It's technically not a continuous string of characters, but Excel is going to identify it as a continuous string of characters, including those spaces. So now all I have to do is go down and hit OK, and it's going to add a line add an item to my pivot table. And there it is, gross margin. Now it still looks like a number. Actually, it looks like I take that back. It's a formula up there. So I've got my formula, and it tells me what the formula is. In addition, if I go over here to accounts and do a drop down, there's my gross margin item right there. So I've got gross margin. Now what I could do, for example, is I could go up here and turn all these off and just do gross margin, and it would summarize my table, and all I'd see is gross margin, right? Now, I might not really want to do that, and the way I'd bring it, I go back here to my filter, I'd go back and turn all those on, and it'll bring them all back for me. Now, we may also want to add some others. First, I'm going to move gross margin. I'm going to go up here. I'm going to click on it. I'm going to drag it up after cost of sales. And I've got gross margin, revenue, cost of goods sold, then gross margin. I've got distribution expenses, facilities expenses, and SG&A. Maybe I want total expenses in here. So how I do that? I simply add another item. I'm going to go up to Pivot Table Analyze, Fields and Items. I'm going to go to Calculated Item. We're going to say expenses to our total expenses. And there it is. I'm going to hit Tab, and now I'm going to double click on Distribution plus Facilities plus SG&A. Hit OK. And there's my total expense line. I might also want a net income line, so I'll do another. Fields Item Sets, Calculated Item. We'll call that Net Income. Tab, we'll say that's going to be gross margin minus total expenses. There it is. I hit OK, and I'm going to have that item down there. Now because I put them in the right order, they ended up where I want them to be. Now, when I look at this data now, I've sort of got some information here. But what if somebody comes to me and says, oh, we forgot to put in sales discounts. Oh, my goodness, I've got to add another item in here. So we're going to do that. We're click in this first column. We're going to go to Fields, Items, and Sets. We're going to add a calculated item, and we're going to add sales discounts. Now notice I do not have to obey the naming conventions here. I hit Tab, and it's going to be revenue, double click, times 0.02, because my sales discount is going to be 2%. And I hit OK, and it's going to add that line. I'm going to take that line, and I'm going to drag it up. Now I want you to know gross margin right now is $171,000. I'm going to drag sales discounts up right between gross margin and cost. I'm going to put it between revenue and cost of sales. And gross margin didn't change. That's because the formula for gross margin is still revenue minus costs. I need to include sales discounts in that. So how do I do that? I can actually edit my item. I can click on that item. I can go to Fields, Items, and Sets, Calculated Items. Now, right now it's in Add mode, but I want to be in Modify mode. So I'm going to click my down arrow. It's going to identify all the items that I added, and one of them is gross margin. Now what I'm going to do, I'm going to go over here, and I'm not going to click on Modify. I'm going to go back down into my formula. I'm going to subtract, double click on Sales Discounts, and now I'm going to hit OK. And when it does that, it's going to change my gross margin, and now I've updated that. It also updated my net income number. So that's how you would insert a calculated item into a pivot table, and how you would then go in later and edit that calculated item if you need to. Hopefully this was helpful. See you real soon on Stuff in Excel.